For this video, we're going to introduce a different type of T-chart thinking that I informally call the intelligent T-chart. And it's kind of a useful style of thinking that'll definitely come into play as you go through your calculus career. Um, so it'll seem unusual and it might seem a little unnecessary in the beginning, but how dare you think it be unnecessary, because later on in the course you will love it. So let's go back to the good old days of seventh grade when you were young and awkward and you were working with an equation like this and you were introduced to T-charts, probably even before seventh grade. Of course, when you first started out with T-charts, you just plugged in a 1, 2, and a 3 and you were darn proud of yourself. Some of you ventured into plugging in a 0, and then at some point, either by your own volition or the encouragement of your teacher, you ventured into the negative numbers for your x inputs. And then as you started to apply sometimes equations to real problems or real scenarios, you might choose x values that are appropriate to the scenario. And as you went through your education, your math education, you started becoming more and more adventurous with the x values that you would plug into a T-chart. Well, I don't know where you've left off, but we're going to really go crazy on the x values that we plug into our T-chart. And to do that, I've selected an equation that you may or may not know what this looks like. So I hope you don't know what it looks like, because it makes this example a little bit better. But some of you who really know the families of functions very well can probably graph this without a T-chart. The other people would be annoyed by you, by the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a T-chart, but it's going to be kind of in a fashion that you're not used to, using the same equation, y equals 3 over x minus 5. Oh, that's terrible focus. That's bad news. Hold on, I'm going to pause this and try to fix this. Okay, we're back. That focus isn't the greatest, but we'll survive. We're going to use this equation in a T-chart, and you may or may not be able to see. I've written in pencil the numbers we're going to end up plugging into this T-chart, and there's some crazy ones, like you may be able to see negative 10,000 or 4.999 and other weird numbers. I'm going to take you through the thinking on why I would do this. The first thing I would do is I would look at this equation and I would say, what are some interesting spots on the graph of this? And I know x equals 5 would blow up the denominator. Big explosion. So the very first number I might put in my T-chart is a 5. And I know that's going to give me an undefined value. So that means something crazy is happening to this function at x equals 5. So because something crazy is happening at x equals 5, I'm very interested in the areas around x equals 5. This is not something that you would have normally thought to do, because I think in your math education up to now, if you were interested in what's going on around 5, you would have said, well, let's investigate 4 and 3 and 6 and 7 and see what y values we get. But we're going to one-up that. Instead of going to 4 and 3 and 2, and down here 6 and 7 and 8, I'm going to take a very microscopic look at what's going on around 5. So what I'm going to do is kind of sneak up on it from both the left side and the right side. So everything that you see written there is me taking a very microscopic look at what's happening around x equals 5. So let's not worry about the y values just yet. I'm also going to think about this. As I move away from x equals 5, in fact, as I move way out to the left-hand side approaching negative infinity, or the right-hand side approaching positive infinity, I would like to know what's happening to this graph. So to do that, I say, well, let's start heading out to negative infinity. And I know you're thinking, how are we ever going to plug these crazy numbers into that equation? The good thing is we're just going to be able to estimate. Okay, I also said earlier that I want to check out what's going on as I go to positive infinity. So I start plugging in, or thinking of plugging in, these big numbers. So now what I've done is I've created this customized t-chart that will take a intensive look at what's happening near that explosion spot, and also what's happening way out to the left and way out to the right. So now my next problem is I need to come up with some y values, and I told you that I don't need to be exactly perfect, I just need some good estimates. Okay, I've taken the time to fill in some of these y values. So I went to this section, and these numbers were very easy to plug into the equation and come out with some y values. As I get to the negative 20, negative 100, and these negative huge ones, it's not going to be so easy to get an exact number, but we can spot a trend. So I'm just thinking about a trend as I look over here. And what's happening is I keep plugging a bigger negative number in here. So if I plug in a negative 100, I get 3 over about negative 105, which is pretty tiny. But then I plug in a negative 1,000, I get 3 over negative 1,005. I could plug in even like a 10 million if I wanted, and it's basically a 3 over negative 10 million, give or take a little bit. I think I'm screwing up the minus 5 part, but the minus 5 almost doesn't matter. So what's happening is I'm getting a 3 over a negative huge number, which is basically heading towards 0. So the more I go in this direction, the more my result gets closer and closer to 0. And you can kind of see that coming here as these are trending towards 0. The same thing is going to happen down below. I'm going to have to adjust here. As I start plugging in the 6, 7, 8, 10, and 20 into here, I start with figures I can pretty much do on my own. As soon as I start getting to these bigger ones, and remember, in theory, I'm heading to 1 billion and even more. Well, as I start plugging these larger numbers in, I end up with a trend, and the trend is that it's a 3 divided by something positive and huge, which means it's trending towards 0. I'll never get to 0, but I'm going to get darn close to 0. What's actually happening here, if I would take the time to figure out every single one of those y values, they'd continue to get smaller, closer to 0, but they'd never become negative, which means we have an asymptote there. Now, these two regions right here where I was taking a microscopic look at what's happening close to 5, there's going to be more trend thinking here. So I'm going to think about what's happening in this region. In theory, I keep taking one of these and plugging them into there. If I took the 4.5, it's 3 divided by 4.5 minus 5, which is really 3 divided by negative 1/2, which would be a negative 6. If I take a 4.9 and plug that in, that's really now a 3 divided by 4.9 minus 5, which is a negative 0.1, which is a negative 30. If I plug this in, you can do the math if you feel like it, it's negative 300. This would be negative 3,000. So notice that what's happening, if I continue to get closer to 5, I keep getting a negative huger number. So I'm kind of heading towards negative infinity. That's where I'm headed. I'm thinking of a trend, And without plugging into the numbers into the actual equation, I can be thinking about this trend in my mind. Okay, so the same thing over here. If I plugged a 5.5 into that equation, can I get those both? Yeah. It's 3 divided by a positive 1/2, so that's a 6. Plug a 5.1 in, that's 3 divided by a 0.1, which is a 30. You get my point, which means we're headed towards positive infinity. Okay, a whole bunch of minutia has happened, and I don't expect that you're necessarily going to be doing this for every single problem that you see, but it's the style of thinking, knowing to investigate a certain spot, take a very close look at the area near that spot, and also investigate what's happening to my function as I go out to positive and negative infinities. So if I took all of this stuff together and turned it into one graph, I'll show you what that looks like here. Okay, unfortunately I can't fit the entire t-chart onto the screen as well as the graph, but I'll point out this is the graph of y equals 3 over x minus 5, and a few of you might have known that before you ever did the t-chart, but this spot at x equals 5 is my asymptote. Just to the left of x equals 5, I'm heading towards negative infinity. Just to the right of x equals 5, I'm heading to positive infinity. As I head way out to positive infinity on the x-axis, my y values are heading to 0. As I head out to negative infinity, my y values are in negative territory, but they're also heading to 0. And because this is just an estimate, I'm sure some of my points in these regions are off, but the general shape of the function is evident because we're just using a very unusual style of thinking with our t-chart. I know that's new and I know that's awkward, but you will come to appreciate that style of thinking as we go through the course.